right, Numbers chapter 1. I want to kind of use these first two chapters to talk about some things that are probably going to recur throughout the book of Numbers. And first and foremost, it's that whole term, numbers. In a lot of ways, it is going to be a corollary to our term for a census, the way that we count our citizens. But beyond just the numbers of numbering citizens, it's going to help us understand the roles that God was assigning for each family and each group of families in Israel. And it's going to start off with something pretty interesting. They weren't numbering everyone, but a select group of folks in the nation. Starting off kind of midway down in verse 2 of chapter 1, every male, head by head, from 20 years old and upward, all in Israel who are able to go to war. And so it's not the younger men in Israel. It's not even the women. That's going to raise an issue that we want to talk about. But it's going to be the men who are capable of going to war, not simply all the men over the age of 20, but those capable of going to war. And so why is it that God chose to number his people first and foremost by the soldiers, understanding that among the groups left out were the Levites, because he's going to say that the Levites are dedicated to him in replacement for the firstborn. That is still a part of what God is trying to get across to them, is an important value, since he spared their firstborn. Their firstborn were not spared the angel of death in Egypt because they were just better people. And so understand this, God is going to have the Levites as a reminder of that to them. But before that, the whole concept of numbering the soldiers helps us understand that each person in Israel had a role. And ultimately, when different roles are apportioned out in a family or a body, it can be really easy to begin to devalue one another's roles. Why? Because we know by the time we get to the New Testament, Paul is going to spend a significant amount of time helping the Corinthians not to nitpick and fight against one another because of the different roles they have in the body of Christ, not trying to inflate the value of their role at the expense of devaluing someone else's. And that's where I want to go back to that whole issue of women being left out of the census. See, one of the things that Paul is also going to write in multiple letters to churches is that in eternity, there is no distinction between male and female. However, the fact that society has traditionally given different roles to men and women has created a lot of bitterness and resentment and infighting. And so now we live in a society that traditionally looks down on these roles as they're stated by God as he's starting out the nation of Israel. Even if you look at modern Israel today, the traditional roles between men and women are probably not going to look a whole lot like what God is describing here. And so why is that important to talk about here? Well, it's important not to ignore the things that the Bible talks about that rub our culture the wrong way, but it's also important to understand some of the wisdom in what God is doing here. And I started to see that the more I traveled, and I went to places in the third world where the culture is quite naturally more aligned with what you see written biblically here. And the world's not falling apart. As a matter of fact, of all the problems that they're having that we are typically assisting with in the foreign aid fields, their family structures are not the problem, or they're not a contributing factor to their poverty. However, sometimes what happens is in trying to help them get out of poverty, we can feel like it's important for us to recast their families in our image. And this is the problem I've seen with that. The New York Times is in the midst of a series called The Inner Pandemic, looking past COVID to a pandemic that in many ways predated it. And that is the high rate of anxiety and depression amongst adolescents and teens. The questions that they're looking at in that series aren't necessarily all that different from questions we've had for years about work-life balance. And all of those things go to the choices that we've made as a society that allow us to be more prosperous, but without fully understanding all the costs that go along with it. Costs that not every society is struggling with to the degree we are here in the States. Understanding many of those societies have cultures with family structures that are not all that different from what God is describing here in the book of Numbers and will be developed on through later books of the Bible and later chapters. Understanding this, I might for my own family choose a structure similar to what God is describing here, but that doesn't give me the right to look down on you for your choices. Likewise, if you understand what it's like for people trying to impose their family values onto your family choices, please likewise don't do the same thing by imposing your family values on people who simply believe there's still some wisdom here for choices they want to make for their own families.